Very excited to be here. First off, when you really think about 2020 and the impact of 2020, it's really brought a lot of things. For a lot of us, you didn't have a lot of changes. For most of us, there has been a paradigm shift in a lot of things. And so talking about just what we're here today to discuss has given us a chance to be able to look at it from a different perspective. So I've been in healthcare for about 17 years, and so extremely excited to lead this panel. And so what I want to do first is to allow the panelists to be able to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get into some questions. So panelists.
You want to go in alphabetical order?
Since you talk first, we'll go ahead and start.
Yeah. I can do that. Hello, everybody. My name is Wynne. I'm really thrilled to be here. I have the pleasure of leading the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at Spark Therapeutics. Prior to joining Spark in December of last year, I was doing diversity work at Facebook for a period of time. Before that, I was leading the D&I efforts at QVC. And prior to that, I started my career at Vanguard. So I've been all over. I got some pretty decent breadth of experience in which I've seen the DE&I work firsthand and been a part of leading these efforts, and really excited to now be jumping into this space of gene therapy, and even more excited to be sharing this time with you all this evening, and really thrilled to be able to share the stage with these esteemed panelists that I get to speak with today. So that's all for me. I guess I can hand it over to Kristy.
Thanks, Amber. I'm Dr. Kristy Shuda-McGuire. I am currently the Associate Dean of Biomedical Studies at the Wistar Institute. Prior to Wistar, I was a faculty member at the Community College of Philadelphia, where Wistar and the Community College of Philadelphia have a program called the Biomedical Technician Training Program to train laboratory technicians in biomedical research, including the cell and gene therapy industry.
So I guess I'll go last. So Lamont, Terrell, this is the first time I must say that I've been on a panel with two Lamonts. So I am currently at GSK. I'm the Inclusion and Diversity Lead for GSK. But prior to that, I guess I am a scientist by training. So this is very key to me. So I am a chemist. I spent 14 years in drug discovery. So really, this topic has been just a passion of mine all along, really just trying to make sure that we create a very inclusive and diverse workforce. So just looking forward to spending the time tonight together.
I appreciate it. It will be weird asking Lamont for a question because I'm definitely not used to that. So there was a recent report by McKinsey and Company, and it was titled "Diversity Wins: How Inclusion Matters." And so this report goes into there being a strong business case for both gender diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity in corporate leadership. And again, as we've heard before, this is not something that's new in terms of a lack of diversity in corporate leadership, but because of the events of 2020, it's really put that on a pedestal. And so that the most diverse companies are now more likely than ever to outperform less diverse peers on profitability. So again, we knew that in the diversity space. I've spent 17 years of my life in diversity. We've known that. It's when you think about it in terms of, you can't keep going into the same group all the time and expecting innovation. You get innovation by having a collaboration of thought, if you will. So life science industry, it continues to progress by building and supporting a diverse workforce. But again, there's a lot of work to be done. So the first thing I want to talk about, again, when you think about diversity and you just think about, how much it allows you to be able to get emotional about it, and, from that perspective. I want to know, what does it mean for each of you personally in terms of what does equity and inclusion mean for each of you personally? So we'll go Amber, Kristy, and Lamont.
Yeah, I love this question, and I love the fact that we begin with this question, as I think it's important to ground, all of us in sort of what we mean when we use these terms, right? And so when you ask me, like, on a personal level, what does that mean, as opposed to the definitions that we've all seen come from a lot of the, the corporate space, which sounds, similar, which is good because it sounds like we're all collectively having this sort of raising our awareness and consciousness, but we don't talk much about what it means to us personally. So, for me, I remember early on in my career in the DE&I space, I came across a quote that said something about equity, thinking of equity as like equality is something where you give everybody like a shoe, right? But equity is when you might actually say, let's think about giving everybody a shoe that fits. And so when I think about that, I think about like my own personal experiences. I think about the experiences of those that came before me, right? So we talked about names, right? We talked about names early on in this, and Lamont are saying, well, it's the first time I've been on a panel with another Lamont. Not the first time. I mean, I'm used to being on many panels and being in many spaces with Ambers. And the reason why I find that to be relevant as you ask this question is because I think in a world where we're truly tapping into equity and we're centering that, people like my mother wouldn't have to make choices about the name she was going to give her child based on what kind of job opportunities she thought that I would get if I had a different type of name. So my mom tells me this story all the time of like, I love the name Amber, but truthfully, I gave you that name thinking about the world that you'd be entering into and what kind of name I could give you that wouldn't cut you off from certain opportunities, because people could either assume that, things about your race or where you come from based on your name. And so part of the reason why I gave you this name was because I was being strategic for you and thinking about what opportunities you might have in front of you. Similarly, my mom has tons of stories that come to mind, but my mom is someone who has visual impairments, right? Which is one of the reasons coming to Spark was so intriguing to me, because of, the medicines that and the treatments that Spark is working on that are particularly, focusing on people with inherited retinal disease, right? But for my mom, she struggled with visual impairment for 25, 30 years, through the period of time where the Americans with Disabilities Act came up. She never asked for an accommodation, never was something that she pushed forward, because she didn't want to be one of those, she says, one of those people who was difficult to manage or difficult to hire. And so she felt like asking for accommodations would label her as someone who wasn't confident. And so when I think about what these terms mean to me personally, it's a world where we all feel empowered to not only ask for what we need, but to also go into spaces where our needs are being centered, regardless of where we come from, right? Everyone is thinking about, what can I do to make sure that this person thrives? And I understand that this person's needs may be very different than another person's needs. And when you think about the workplace, that's one environment, but I love the fact that today we're planning to talk about how diversity and equity and inclusion spans everything that we do, right? And the community, in our, economic landscape, in the workplace. So for me, I think, personally, equity really is a world where, everyone can see that their needs have been thought of with intention, and that they're in a space where they will be supported with the things they need to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. McGuire.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks, Lamont. I think for me, being a woman in science, I was always very acutely aware of diversity and equity issues. And even though, women are not underrepresented in science, in the life sciences, until higher levels at the PhD or above, it always seemed like, something that, you were made aware of, even in undergraduate and graduate research. In terms of one of the things that drew me to teaching at a community college was the mission of community colleges as open access institutions. So education for all who may benefit, without, some of the, issues that go into admissions at other institutions, right? Community colleges are, great equalizers of educational opportunity. And then I think for me, the choice to come to Wistar, Wistar's programs especially the biomedical technician training program, which has been around since 2000, have always been focused on making the life sciences more inclusive. And so, although it seems like something new that everybody just got around to talking about last year, right? We feel like we've been doing this at Wistar for a long time and have really seen the importance of having a diverse team of scientists working together in our labs and at our institution.
Love it. Lamont.
Let me unmute. Yeah, so diversity, equity, inclusion is very personal to me. Is why I'm doing what I do today. So if anyone knows me, they'll know my story. So very similar to Kristy in grad school, I also quickly realized that I was the one of only quite often. And then when I decided to step away from doing science, I realized that I was stepping away, and there's one less African American scientist, PhD scientist doing research at GSK. But I realized that, my call in this life is to make the world better place than where I came. So I took that step, and that's me, because I want to make sure that it is always a much better place than where I started. And hopefully one day it'll come to a point where privilege does not matter. If someone know me once again, they'll know I also have privilege. I'm African American, but I'm not the first in my family to get a PhD. I'm not the first even in my siblings to get a PhD. So I knew what it would take. I knew probably as early as the 7th, 8th, or 8th grade that I was going to be a scientist. That's something I always wanted. So I knew I had role models. So to me, it's very personal, because how can we ensure that every individual that wants to do science has role models, has people that they could look up to, so that now they know what I can do that. So that's why, to me, it's just something that I'm very passionate about. I get choked up sometimes just because when I see kids, I call them kids, I'm a kid myself still. I just love reaching out and then touching them. In my role, I don't do science anymore, but I'm fortunate enough that I'm able to talk to scientists all the time, just because I bring that very unique perspective to this space. I lived it for 14 years, so I know how it is to feel like when I look around, I look to the left, I look to the right, and it's just me. If I look up in my organization at one time, I didn't see anyone that looked like me in senior leadership. So things are changing, but people that's on this journey with us today, we can hopefully supercharge it so that it will be more and more of diverse individuals in the sciences.
Lamont, I love that. I came from a family where I was the first across, not only but also all of my mom's siblings. And so from that perspective, I didn't have that, that role model, as you mentioned. I didn't have that blueprint. And everything was, the next level was always going to be an unknown, which made it scary, right? Because you didn't have anybody that you can talk to. So that created obstacles. And I knew going into science was going to be an obstacle, because I didn't even want to dissect a frog. So I knew that science was going to be an obstacle for me. But I'm going to ask you, again, the panelists, speaking of obstacles, what are the obstacles that you see in cell and gene sector in terms of, and it could be anything, whether it's recruitment, retention, or anything else like that. What are the major obstacles that you see?
I guess I can start, or are we going A, K, L?
It was open, but
Okay, it was
Lamont, go
open.
ahead, if you don't mind, go ahead and start.
Okay, yeah, no, I definitely don't mind, because I think about this a lot, because this is just a passion of mine, because I want to find scientists of diverse. So the obstacle to me is always, if you think about it, is balancing the speed with trying to get something to the market, trying to understand it. The science, cell gene therapy is a very hot science, and then diversity. All right, you have those three things around a triangle: speed, doing great science, quality science, and then diversity. And a lot of times people always push the inclusion part, the diversity part back, right? We want to be the first to the market. We want to have the top scientists. We want to have all that stuff and not really think about inclusion and diversity. So to me, it's getting people to want to have the diversity as part of one of those ones that you have to have. And yes, it may take you a little bit longer to find that talent, but you may have to spread out where you look for the talent. You may not have to go to just 4 or 5 universities. You may have to go to 10 or 20 universities. So to me, it's just find that balance between really and truly valuing inclusion and diversity, and yet and still being able to drive the business. Because that is that, that dynamic, right? You want to be fast, but you also want to try to have inclusion and diversity.
Kristy, what about you? What are the obstacles?
So I think our two biggest challenges, one are getting students to see biomedical research, biotechnology, the cell and gene therapy industry in particular, as a viable career pathway, right? So, students often say they want to go to medical school, right? Because they've had interactions with doctors, or they say they want to go to nursing school because they've had interactions with nurses. But, scientists are in the lab. Prior to Anthony Fauci, really not many people even knew a scientist. So, being able to see science as a career path is definitely, one challenge that we have. And then the other is access. So cell and gene therapy companies want to hire people who have experience, right? So how do you get that lab experience? And that's one of the things our, programs at Wistar address for high school students and undergraduate students, including community college students, is we provide that access so students get that experience, and then they become in demand and their resumes stand out in the hiring pool.
Love it. Amber.
Yeah, I would agree with everything I've heard so far. I definitely think that, like any other industry that I've been in, right? Like we have the sort of final outcomes, like representation, that are obvious issues that we're all trying to address, right? Like representation up and down the leadership chain. Because sometimes you can see really decent representation at a certain level, but you don't really see that reflected up the leadership chain. And so one of the things that I like to talk about, instead of always focusing on like what those, end goals are, or those end outcomes, like how can we start to look earlier in the pipeline? How can we start to even look beyond just the representation and start to think about how did we get here in the first place, right? And so I think one of the things that I see as a special part about gene therapy, since I've been in this space, right? People in this industry are brilliant, right? Like these are really smart people, present company included, right? That are a part of this space. And one of the things that I think is a challenge behind that is because, you get to this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there's no hypothesis, scientific method, algorithm that we can put together that's going to solve this, right? And being able to bring people to the space where they can be comfortable with being uncomfortable, comfortable with knowing that there is no checklist that we can give that's going to allow you to just walk in and just solve this really quickly, right? Like this is something that we have to look back many, many years to try and figure out, like, how did we get to this place of structural inequity, right? And so when we start to look at that and we can actually start to say like, okay, we all inherited this system that we're all a part of, but the more we can start to acknowledge, the more we can start to then address and dismantle some of those things that we don't even understand are sort of like unconsciously holding us back from this diversity, equity, and inclusion utopia we say we all really want. So for me, I've had to spend a lot of time, at making sure that, as people approach this, they have that consciousness and they're building the resilience. One of the things I hear a lot is a term that I like to use a lot is diversity fatigue. And I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's that idea that like you come into this space and you have all the energy, right? And you're like, I'm going to do what I need to do to be a part of the change. And then you work and you work and you work and you're like, wait, you're looking at your metrics again and you're saying like, why isn't this changed? We've been working on this for a whole year. It should be, we should have solved this by now. But it's not something that is going to change overnight. So ensuring that everyone is equipped and really in it for the long haul is really important. I do think that we're in a moment right now that I hope becomes a movement. I'm sure you all have heard that before, right? I'm hoping that this renewed energy and support that has been turned, back to the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, because we've sort of seen this before. I hope that it's sustainable. And so one of the things that I just, every chance I get, I'm always encouraging people, like, make sure that you are giving yourself enough grace, you're giving yourself enough time to be able to really make meaningful change that you can sustain. And that looks different depending on what environment you're in. But I do think that the more we have like forums like this where we can share best practices and we can support each other in this work, I think that's what's really going to make sure that this is in fact a movement and not a moment.
So first of all, thank you for that, Amber. Stay with you for a second. Think about change. What's important to make change is really culture. You think about a culture. Some organizations may have a culture that is that embraces change. Some cultures, you're going to have some challenges when it comes to change. And this is any change, not just the change that we're talking about in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the question that I have is, how is the cell and gene therapy sector creating a culture of equality? And this specifically is by the recruitment, retaining, and developing a workforce from all different dimensions of diversity. So how is the sector creating a culture of equality?
I think, for one, I think all of that is emerging, right? Like, I think we're at the space now where it's somewhat of an inflection point, right? Because this is still an emerging field. There's still a lot of movement and growth that's happening. And so a lot of us are thankfully being brought to this conversation at a great time, right? Where we can look at an industry, say, for instance, like the tech industry where I just came from, and be able to say, we see some of the mistakes that were made there, right? Like we see, on so many different levels, the fact that we could have been, to Kristy's point, paying more attention to the exposure of young people very, very early and ensuring that they understand that this is a space that has a lot of opportunity, that they have the capabilities and the talent to be able to go into this space, and giving them the support to get through it. So I think what I see that's different and that's special about this moment that we're in is that we're all really ready and approaching this with a boldness that I don't think we've seen in some of the other industries. I think from a talent acquisition perspective, one of the things that I think is key is that we're spending time working with our hiring managers, working with our talent acquisition partners, like our recruiters and our sourcers, and we're creating very thoughtful and intentional strategic plans that say, having a diverse slate is something that is a priority to us. So we're not going to move forward in our hiring process if we can't achieve a certain threshold of diversity, however we want to define that, in the slate of folks that we're looking at for different roles, right? And I think to Lamont, Terrell's point, we're being mindful that might take more time. And then what I'm seeing is that there's folks who are willing to take that on. Like there is there's always, everybody wants stuff yesterday, but I think with this particular strategic initiative, right, of making sure that we're bringing in as much diversity as we can on the front end, a lot of folks have come to the realization that like this will take a little bit more time, and it's important enough to what we're trying to create, the culture that we're trying to create, to your point, Lamont Robinson, that we're going to take that time. And furthermore, we're going to hold people accountable. So everyone who is involved in that, hiring process understands what it is that's being asked of them, and then is being held accountable for those outcomes, on the back end of that.
Appreciate that. So Dr. McGuire, same question. How was the
Lamont, I lost your audio for a little bit there, but I think one of the things, especially at Wistar, is that science has always been very international. So we have, scientists from 30 countries working at Wistar. And so, there's an appreciation of that diversity that's already there. And then, just trying to make sure that as diverse as we are internationally, we're also diverse on the talent that we're drawing locally. So, I think that's been great. I think exactly what Amber said, cell and gene therapy being in, a young industry and already having this as a priority is great. But the fact that they're drawing from research institutes and academic institutions in the area who have been thinking along this way, for at least the past decade, if not longer, I think helps. So they have people who are coming from academia and research institutes into a new industry who've already have that mindset.
I love it. Lamont.
Yeah, and very similar to Kristy and Amber, we definitely have the challenge in the processes that we have for recruitment. And then I think personally myself, and I take it to a different level. Like I challenge the scientists. I mean, like I said, by me being a scientist, I always say when we do these academic collaborations, a lot of universities are looking to increase their inclusion and diversity. Let's make sure that if we're going to fund a postdoc or fund some type of study, that they make sure that that student is of a diverse background. So even this week is very ironic that I got 3 emails from my company this week about, hey, Lamont, what are we going to do in the C and G T space for recruitment, both the US and UK? So I don't know if it was because of the LinkedIn post, but at least, or just because we are doing things, and then the leaders, kind of go back to your question about Coach Lamont Robinson. It all starts from the leadership. So we have leaders in our organization that values inclusion and diversity, and therefore it's easier for me to do my role because I know they want inclusion and diversity. So when we find external partners, we always try to find those partners that also have the same mission that we have. They want to increase the number of minority scientists. So really, I just think it just goes to, especially for a company as besides the GSK, we do a lot of collaborations. Let's just make sure that when we do those collaborations, at least bring up the topic of inclusion and diversity so that we can better spend our money. So I really think it's going to take a partnership. We can't do it alone in industry, and we can't do it alone in academics. How can we work together?
Love it. Is my audio back on? Oh,
Yes.
Fantastic. So, Dr. McGuire, since you pointed out my audio, I'm gonna ask you a question. What work still needs to be done in this space to promote a culture of equality and inclusion? What do you think needs to be done in this space?
So again, I said really, letting young people know about science as a career pathway, I think is, one of the most important things. And we have some great initiatives in Philadelphia to do that. But then, really following through with the support that's needed. So, if you have a student say, they want to be a scientist, what is that pathway and how can we support them through, their education and into, a position, whether it's, at a technician position, which might even be below a bachelor's degree to start, or in an early scientist position with a bachelor's degree, or whether it's finishing that PhD and coming out at a more senior scientist level.
Amber, what about yourself? What still needs to be done?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot. I think to build on Kristy's point, one of the things that I have been thinking more about lately is like, how do all of these companies that are entering this space right now be a part of the change in a really strategic way? And so one of the things that we've been talking about a little bit is how do we make sure that, like, where we know there are students or institutions rather that have access to a very diverse student body, how do we go in and then support those programs, right? And the curriculum. So are we working hand in hand with the faculty, reviewing what it is that these students are going to be studying to ensure that they're getting the exposure that they need to be able to be top talent when they graduate, right? And so, when I was in the tech industry, that was something that was really heartbreaking, was that we had students that would come to these coding interviews that are the most intense things you can ever imagine, and a lot of them that were coming from the HBCUs or other historically Black colleges and universities, for those of you that might not know that acronym, those that were coming from those schools, they had great background and really fantastic experience, but they weren't being taught to what the coding interview looks like now, today, right? And so they would get there and they couldn't get through it. So one of the things that's really top of mind for me is like, how do we ensure that the companies that are going to be hiring these people are working hand in hand with the institutions that are educating the most diverse student population? So that's one of the things that I think is, super important. And I think the other, to your point of culture before, I think that we have to start making this diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, the competencies, the topic of it, standard. You know how you can't go into a work environment these days and say something like, I'm not really into compliance, like I don't really do that. Or like deadlines, I don't do deadlines. I just sort of like work at my own pace. Like that doesn't work. So I think we need to have the same sense of like, this is a non-negotiable when we think about this topic of DE&I, right? So when we're hiring people, regardless of if they fall into any one or many diversity dimensions, we should be asking everyone questions about competence and inclusive leadership in this space. So tell me about how you manage across difference, right? Like tell me about how you've leveraged the diversity that exists within your team before to achieve innovation or superior outcomes in one way or another. And so I think the more that becomes standard, to how we hire, how we reward people with promotions and bigger opportunities, it shouldn't be that you are, at the first time you're asked to really dig into this topic is when you've reached it to the highest levels of leadership. Like we should be thinking about this the whole way through our organizations. And I think that's what will start to make the real culture shifts.
I appreciate that. Lamont, before we go to you, Tracy, did you have I saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
I was just clapping at Amber's thoughts. I thought it was really thought-provoking. So no hand up, just saying.
Thank you.
Got it. Lamont, what could be done?
What could be done? I could say, don't do what we did last year. I mean, that's my story to everybody. We just cannot repeat what has been done because we know what's going to happen. We probably will not succeed just because the past has shown us that. That would be the first thing. And really, probably beyond that, what more to be done? I think we really have to just increase the talent pool. I think you mentioned about having mentors. I think that's so key. I mean, a lot of people give a lot of money out there for many different efforts, but that's one thing. But how can we make sure that those individuals that we're giving the money to see a scientist, talk to a scientist, to understand this is what you really can do with your degree? Just giving money and then supporting kids in college and stuff, to me, we're really not maximizing that dollar because we're not connecting them back to someone that they could look up to. Just like Kristy, I think she mentioned, a lot of people want to be pre-med. I was pre-med at first. And I tell this story all the time that someone changed my major for me, my first semester in college. So I went and I said, hey, Dr. Wilson, my major had been changed. He said, yeah, I changed your major. Just be math and chemistry. You can do whatever you want to do. And then luckily he was able to change my major because it was my uncle. So he was the provost of the university. So I could tell people I got privilege. So he was able to say, whatever your major is, I'm going to change it because I know math and science, math and chemistry can do what you want to do. So I really think we just got to have more mentors, more people talking to students and really giving them advice so that, you know what, this is what you can do. So we should start like in high school, like the Philadelphia STEM Equity Collective that GSK is doing. We have to do it collectively as a group also. Companies can't do it by themselves. So how can us as a collective really have an impact on the community? Have everybody that needs to be around the table and begin to develop programs and processes that help all the students get from K all the way up through grad. So that's a real, just a sermon what I think we need to do.
You know, I love your point about having a mentor. You know, I grew up in a very bad neighborhood in Chicago on the West Side, and we didn't have those examples. And so, in fact, pharmaceuticals meant something completely different on the West Side of Chicago. So for us, we didn't know what a scientist was. I mean, we knew the gist of it, but we knew the basic job. So, are you going to be a doctor? Are you going to be a lawyer? Are you, just we didn't understand the elements. So having a person, especially if you can job shadow or things like that, to me, just giving exposure to some of these kids, because what they don't know is that you should follow your passion, not necessarily a job. You should follow what that passion is and then see the jobs that would support having that passion, or else you're not going to enjoy what you're doing. So I really appreciate that. So what are your suggestions first of all, let me pause for a second. The audience, if you guys have any questions, please type it into to the chat. We'd love to hear from you as well, and we'd love to ask questions that you may have. And so just be thinking about that. But one of the questions I have as well is, what are your suggestions for equality initiatives, specifically in the cell and gene therapy companies? So what are your suggestions that's out there? Or it may exist today, it may be something that we do in the future, but what are your suggestions?
So I'm going to suggest that any companies reach out to us at Wistar. So one of the things about our biomedical technician training program, and Lamont, Terrell, we were one of the beneficiaries of one of the first GSK STEM Equity Collective grants in Philadelphia to support our initiative. But we do a hands-on laboratory training for the students, and then we place them in two lab experiences, lab rotations, one in academia and the other in industry. So we would love to expand our current industry partners. We've had long-term partners at the Science Center of Invisible Sentinel and Integral Molecular. So we are always looking for new companies to partner with us and help us train those students as part of our program. And then one other plug I wanted to give, since Amber mentioned HBCUs, Wistar has a new program with Cheney University. So our program with Community College of Philadelphia and other regional community colleges is going to be a one summer program. And we've expanded to work with, 4-year institutions, including Cheney University for 2 summers. So those students will be doing, academic internships at Wistar this summer, but we'll be looking for industry placements for them next summer. So I think, tapping into things that are already going on would be great. And then if your company is big enough, like Amber's, to be able to, start your own program, we'd love to help and advise. So if you're a small company just starting out, tap into something that's, already established. And, even if you're a larger company, we're happy to help set up some training initiatives to really get those students, whether they're in high school or while they're undergraduates, that experience that they need to be able to want to stay in biotechnology and cell and gene therapy, and then to really be able to have the experience to be hired into those positions.
Amber, do you have any suggestions?
I think if I had to boil it down to one thing, it would be to make sure you address this as you would any other strategic initiative. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see sometimes is companies really wanting to do this, but not necessarily taking the time to think about how it could be done right. And really thinking about, okay, so if we were to treat this like any other strategic initiative, we would think long and hard about what's the right talent that's needed to lead this. How do we ensure we have the right, metrics, the right accountability, the right resources that we're investing in this. I think too often you can see organizations jump into this, and if they're not thinking about it strategically, they'll say, oh, well, who's really passionate about this? We'll just let them do it, right? And maybe they'll do it in their free time. That's like the worst possible thing, is when you just sort of tack this onto somebody's, already existing, very, very tight work schedule. Sometimes you see, space created for that person to actually like dedicate themselves to this full time. But if they don't have, the network, the experience, if they're not the right person for the job, you could see yourself sort of going in a lot of fits and starts and sort of trying a whole bunch of things, because like I tell people all the time, like a space like corporate citizenship or like community engagement, right? Like everything feels really good in this space. It's hard to say, like, what are we going to ruthlessly prioritize and say, here are the initiatives that are going to be, most effective and most urgent for us right now. So we're going to do these things, and we're going to make sure we do them really well, as opposed to just trying to do everything. So yeah, my biggest, point that I would leave folks with is just make sure you're being strategic about it, the same way you would any other strategic initiative within your organization.
Thank you. Lamont.
Yeah, and then I'll build on that. Be strategic and also fund it. I mean, you can't do some of this work without the proper funding. You have to have a long-term view. This is not going to be solved overnight. You definitely have to have those short-term goals, but also just realize that we have to think about this long-term. I think from a talent perspective, we have to, don't look for that perfect candidate. Develop your own talent. As long as they have some of they got to have the core basic skills, but if they don't, I think someone mentioned a CRISPR earlier today. On their call, they're not a CRISPR expert, but they have dabbled in it a little bit. Let them develop that skills on the job, and therefore now you may more likely to be able to hire a different candidate just because you're not so, the job role is not so strict. Would be that. Also, I think as a company, you have to be in your community. We are all scientists. We all love giving back. We should be at the local universities. So any company in Philadelphia should be tied to the universities in Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia is a very unique place because there's a lot of different types of universities here. We should be tapping into that. We should be influencing the curriculum at the universities, right? This is the type of skill set that we're going to need in 5 to 10 years. Let me help you develop that curriculum so that when your students graduate, not this freshman class, but the next freshman class that come in, they're going to have the skill sets that we need. So I really think it's just all about just having that partnership, just get in the community, get into the schools, and just make sure that wherever you are, influence the change. I think is always needed.
We've got some questions that are starting to roll in, and so I'm gonna ask the panelists, and we'll start with Amber. We'll go Kristy, and then we'll go Lamont. So, what are best practices to maintain diverse talent in the cell and gene therapy space, and life science space?
Maintaining, is that the?
Yeah, so best practices to maintain diverse talent in that space.
So I saw another question in there that I think could be aligned to this one, just specifically asking about like retention strategies. And I think honestly, retention is one of those topics that I don't think is talked about enough in this space. So I'm really excited to see that someone was, thinking about that, because I think if we don't start to talk about that and really be, again, strategic about how we're retaining the diverse talent, it just becomes a revolving door, right? Like we do all this work, we find the talent, we get them in the door, but then our environment is not one that creates that sense of belonging. People aren't necessarily feeling like, they're seen or they're cared for at the organization. And so, they leave. I think if I could get really tactical in terms of some things that I have seen be really effective, right? Sometimes when it comes to diverse talent, however you want to define that, or underrepresented talent in one way or another, there can often be a lack of a network, right? Like a lack of, we talked about like exposure and visibility for folks that are feeling like, I think Lamont, Terrell put it as like, like the lonely only or whatever, right? And so sometimes you can see folks just saying, all right, well, I'm gonna just put my head down and do my work, right? I'm just doing, and they do whatever it is that they are assigned really, really well, knock it out the park, but there's a lack of visibility. So one of the things that I think is really important is to ensure that we are thinking about that and how we're managing performance, assigning work. How do we ensure that as an organization, we have visibility into all of our talent and the aspirations of our talent? So maybe that looks like skip levels in your organization. I know when I was at Vanguard, skip levels were something that were like religious. It was like people had skip levels, and what that was a meeting on a regular cadence with your boss's boss, essentially, like your manager's leader. You have a regular meeting with that person. I think there was like twice a year or something like that. And there was a really structured way in which you were sort of like given a sheet of like how to prepare for that meeting. And part of it was that leader getting a really clear understanding of your experience, your aspirations, what it is they can do to make sure that you're fully engaged. And so I feel like those moments, right, are really, really important for someone to feel seen and for the organization to have a better sense of like, what are we doing well and what could we be working on? And even more, even further, what does this person individually need to really feel sticky here? So like, that's one thing. And I also think we don't talk a lot about sponsorship. So we talk about mentorship a lot. And I think mentorship is very important, right? Like, I don't think I would have gotten to where I've gotten to without mentors that look like me, mentors that didn't look like me. But I think sponsorship is one that's different. And sometimes you see them sort of like coupled together, but like sponsorship in the sense of there is someone who is, a senior leader or more senior than you that is completely 100% invested in your, upward mobility in the organization. And so when you are not in those rooms, right, when this underrepresented talent, whatever we're talking about, is not in those rooms where these decisions are being made about promotions and opportunities and whatnot, that person is advocating for you because they know, or they're advocating for that underrepresented talent, right? Because they know, they have that intimate knowledge of this person's performance, their aspirations, all of that stuff. And I think, for some people, the whole mentorship, sponsorship thing is easy, you know what I mean? Whether it be a matter of privilege or personality or what, like certain people just find a way to build that network or build that sort of what some folks might call like board of directors, the people that are like a part of their success. But for others, it's more difficult for a variety of reasons. And so I think where organizations are interested in stepping into that gap, definitely thinking about, sponsorship and really thoughtful programs that increase, visibility, access, and opportunity is where I think we need to be focused.
Dr. McGuire.
I'm going to agree with Amber. I think, a network is really important, right? People need to be supported on lots of levels, right? And it shouldn't just be one mentor or one sponsor, right? You need the group of people that are, advocating and helping you with different aspects of the job. And then I think it's the pathway, right? For individuals to be able to see what their next step is and to be always working toward that next step, but making sure, that they're appropriately challenged and they know what they need to do, be able to get to that next step.
Yeah, so just to build on it, with both for Kristy and Amber, it's all about sponsorship, mentoring, development. Really, it's you have to have like dedicated development programs for individuals of a diverse background as well as gender, because as Kristy say, as you go up the ladder or in education, the number of female also go down. So really, I think it's just going to take really that focus on the inclusion. A lot of people focus on the D because that's easy to measure, representation. But to me personally, the inclusion, that's where you're really going to make that step change, where you really can have that inclusive environment. So if someone else that comes in that don't look like the norm or like the majority, they can still thrive, not just survive. So you got to create that inclusive environment. Otherwise, it will be a revolving door. People will come in, and 2 years later, even less than that, they're out. Especially now with the pandemic, it'd be very interesting to see, Some people have been in companies up to a year now and haven't been physically in a building. They probably don't have the connection that I have, who's been in a company for 18 years, right? So how can you ensure that personal connection to a company? I think just going forward, our ways of working is going to be much different. So we have to think about not just from a diversity standpoint, just our people in period, our employees, how can we ensure that they feel connected? And we have to do a much better job of making sure everyone feel connected. Otherwise, they're not going to stay around.
Lamont, you mentioned the pandemic. So how has COVID-19 or the pandemic shed light on inequalities in the cell and gene therapy space?
I think it just goes beyond the cell and gene therapy, but definitely, I think it really is the underrepresented groups, groups with less in society. There's that gap, right? Their kids are losing years of education just because they don't have internet, or if they have internet, sometimes the bandwidth is slow, or they don't have computers. So I really just think the pandemic just really just amplified just how the educational gap exists in our society. That people that are fortunate, parents can probably have a tutor come around and then teach the kids while they're working, right? Or for me, luckily, my company has flexibility where I don't have to go into the office. Therefore, I'm able to stay home with my kids. I think really the pandemic just really just pull back the curtains or pull back the sheet to how much our education gap is there, but between the majority and the minority.
Dr. McGuire, what about yourself?
I'm going to agree with Lamont. If you look at our, school systems, right, who's back in school full time and who's not, right? I mean, it's going to be a difference of, less than a year to over a year and a half between when the suburban school districts have been back full time and when Philadelphia city schools are back full time, which, hopefully will be in September. But that's a big impact, and hopefully we can recover a bit from that. But it's something that we're all going to have to work toward.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think from the education standpoint, we saw that really clearly. And things that we probably hadn't even really thought about in terms of inner city schools that might be more crowded, right? So they don't have the space to just say, oh, we're going to go and spread kids out and just, we can have the 6 feet apart desks, like some of the guidance that was given, like by the CDC on like how we need to go about doing school safely was just like not an option for a lot of schools. And so I think that's a really good point. Beyond that, I would say, we in the beginning, I don't know if you all remember, but in the beginning there was like this joke of like, Black people or people of color were like immune to COVID-19, right? Like that was the original joke or the conspiracy theory maybe that was floating around. And then there was this like really massive shift that happened like almost overnight when the numbers started to come in and we all started to realize like, no, actually we're more susceptible because there's more of us that are on the front lines, like to the point that's already been made, that don't have a choice to just say, I'm going to stay home. Because if I stay home, I don't get paid. My family doesn't eat. I can't keep my job, right? These heartbreaking decisions that so many people had to make for survival, they weren't evenly distributed. So, you know what I mean? So, I think that was one of the things. I think the other thing that has been really powerful to me, just stepping into this space, was the amount of conversation that we started to have about a very well-known fact within, like, I'll speak for myself, within the Black community, like the lack of trust that we've had in like medical research or, vaccines or whatever that's historic. This became more of a national conversation, right? When we got to the point where it was like a vaccine was available and we started to see the hesitation that existed within certain communities, and we had to then grapple with that. Well, like, why does this exist? And that goes back to my earlier point of like, we all inherited this system and it's layered. But one of the things that we're all starting to talk about a lot more, I think, is like, how do we ensure that there's more diverse representation? Folks who are underrepresented are a part of research and clinical trials and all the things that lead up to, like for this question, like a vaccine for COVID-19 and thinking about this pandemic holistically, I do think that the structural inequities were, a spotlight was put on that. And hopefully it's one of those things that we don't choose to ever turn away from, because I do think it's really important that we start to address this boldly.
We only have a couple of minutes now, so I'm going to ask each of you to just briefly let me know, what does success look like for you for diversity, equity, and inclusion? So when we're 10 years down the line and we reflect back on the impact of 2020, they've been able to enact some of the suggestions that you've stated. What does success look like for each of you in this space, in the cell and gene therapy space? We'll start Lamont.
Yeah, to me, it would just be representation, where you won't have one-offs anymore. You have a very, robust number of minorities studying cell and gene therapy, leading the science. Let's just say someone have a Nobel Prize would be great, right? So I think it's just really just having better representation, and then which we would definitely need inclusion for that. So that would be success for me if I could look back 10 years like, wow, you know what? I can count. I need more than two hands to count the number of people that's in cell and gene therapy. Would be success.
Dr. McGuire.
Similar. So I would love us to have, a lot more young people saying, I want to be a scientist. And then, having a diverse life sciences workforce.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that aside from that, I definitely think that if we can see ourselves having more of the uncomfortable conversations with a little bit more ease and being able to face that more directly, I think that will be a sign of success. And then I also think, we talked about employment, right? So to Lamont's point, more representation when we talk about workplaces, more representation when we talk about our education, which we've talked about a lot. And then the last, which I don't think we touched on a lot here, would just be like the economic impact. And so when we think about like Philadelphia, for instance, and this being a hub where this space is really growing, how do we ensure that there's access to small businesses owned by women and people of color that can support this growth and be a part of this boom that it looks like we're going to have in this area? So I think that's what success would look like when we look back 10 years.
Thank you. We're at the top of the hour. Again, I'm honored. And please, if you have not looked at their bios of the panelists, please do so. Extremely impressed with the way that they responded. You'll be even more impressed with their backgrounds. Again, I'm honored. I've learned a lot during the session. Hopefully you have as well. And thanks for those of you that presented the questions. If we did not get to your question, I sincerely apologize. There's so much information. But again, thank you, panelists, and thanks for this opportunity to be able to have this session.
Thank you, Lamont.
Thank you.